Wanda is finally saying something that a lot of people have been thinking for a long time. And that is the idea that Melody was not just caught up in drama, but actually betrayed by people she once trusted. And the way Wanda said it was not quiet or careful. She made it very clear that the same people who stood next to Melody, smiled in her face, and benefited from being around her are the same ones who turned around and went against her. That alone says a lot about how things really work behind the scenes, because when someone who has been so defensive for so long suddenly admits something like that, it means there is truth there that can no longer be ignored. What makes this even more interesting is how Wanda connects all of this back to her daughter. She is not just talking about Melody for the sake of telling the truth. She is using Melody's situation almost like an example, like a warning. She is saying, in her own way, that if people could do that to Melody, then what do you think they would do to Tisha? And that is where things start to feel a little strategic. It feels less like honesty and more like positioning, because now the conversation shifts from Melody being wronged to Tisha being at risk. And when you really sit and think about it, that shift changes everything. Instead of focusing on what happened to Melody and how she was treated, the focus becomes about protecting Tisha. And that raises a question. Is Wanda truly speaking out because she feels bad about what happened to Melody? Or is she trying to make people feel sympathy for her daughter? Because those are two very different intentions, and people can feel the difference. Wanda also went deep into the idea that friendships on the show are not real. She said it clearly. Nobody is really friends. Nobody is safe. And that statement alone explains so much of what viewers have been watching for seasons. Because when you remove real friendship from the picture, everything becomes a game. Conversations are no longer honest. They are calculated. People are not talking to understand each other. They are talking to gather information, to use later, to protect themselves, or to create moments for the show. And that is exactly what Wanda described when she talked about people collecting information and then taking it back to someone else. That behavior is not friendship. That is strategy. That is survival in an environment where trust does not exist. And when you hear her say that out loud, it makes you look at every interaction differently. Because now, you are not just watching people argue. You are watching people play roles. But what stands out the most is that Wanda admitted that many of these people were brought onto the show through Melody. That is something that has been said before, but hearing it from Wanda carries a different weight. Because she has not always been quick to give Melody credit, so for her to say that openly means she knows it is true. And it also highlights something important. The same people who got opportunities because of Melody are now part of the group that turned against her. That kind of situation hits differently because it is not just about arguments or misunderstandings. It is about loyalty. When someone helps you, supports you, or brings you into a space, there is an expectation of respect, even if things do not stay perfect. But what Wanda is describing is the opposite of that. It is people benefiting from someone and then turning on them when it suits them. And instead of fully sitting in that truth, Wanda moves quickly to connect it back to Tisha. She is basically saying, look at what they did to Melody, so of course they are going to come after my daughter too. But that argument does not fully land for everyone. Because people remember how Melody was treated, and they also remember who was involved in that treatment. And Tisha was not just standing on the side watching, she played her part in that dynamic. So when Wanda tries to present Tisha as someone who is now at risk, some viewers see it differently. They see it as someone finally experiencing a small part of what was once done to someone else. And that does not mean people want Tisha to be hurt or attacked. It just means that the situation is not as simple as Wanda is trying to make it. Another thing that came up during her live was the idea that Destiny was wrong for speaking to Kimmie about Tisha. Wanda made it seem like that was some kind of betrayal. But when you think about it, people talk to those they feel comfortable with. And if Kimmie had already expressed that being close to Tisha is not easy, then it makes sense that someone would feel safe opening up to her. That is how real conversations happen. People go where they feel understood. So instead of focusing only on Destiny's actions, it is also important to look at the environment that made her feel like she needed to talk to someone else in the first place. Because when someone feels constantly frustrated or unheard, they will find another space to express that. Wanda also kept repeating that Tisha is sensitive, almost like she was trying to explain why she steps in and speaks for her. But sensitivity does not mean weakness. And it does not mean someone cannot speak for themselves. Sometimes sensitivity means awareness. It means feeling things deeply, understanding situations clearly, and reacting in a thoughtful way. So when Wanda uses that word, it feels like she is trying to justify her own actions. Like she is saying, I have to step in because my daughter cannot handle it. But that does not always match what viewers see. Because there have been many moments where Tisha has spoken up for herself, expressed her opinions, and stood her ground. And that brings up another layer to this situation, the role Wanda plays in all of this. Because while she says she is protecting her daughter, there are times when her involvement actually adds more tension. When she speaks strongly, reacts quickly, and jumps into situations, it can make things bigger instead of better. And that is something people have noticed over time. There was also a moment where Wanda talked about nobody being safe on the show. That statement felt different from everything else she said, because it did not just sound like an opinion, it sounded like a warning. Almost like she knows something or feels something shifting. And that could be related to changes happening behind the scenes, or it could just be her way of expressing how unpredictable the environment has become. Either way, it adds to the feeling that things are not stable, that relationships are constantly changing, that alliances can shift at any moment, and that makes it hard for anyone to fully trust anyone else. Because if nobody is safe, then everyone is watching their back. Another point that came up was the comparison between marriages. Wanda mentioned that Tisha has been married much longer than Destiny. And while that may be true, length does not always equal quality. Every relationship is different. Every situation has its own challenges. So, comparing them does not really prove anything. It feels more like an attempt to defend Tisha by highlighting something positive about her situation. But at the same time, it takes attention away from the actual issues being discussed. Because the conversation was not about who has been married longer. It was about behavior, communication, and trust. And when you look at everything Wanda said as a whole, a pattern starts to appear. She admits certain truths, like Melody being betrayed and friendships being fake. But then she quickly redirects the focus to protect her daughter. It is like she is balancing between honesty and defense. And that balance is what makes this situation so interesting, because people can see both sides. They can see the truth in what she is saying, and they can also see the intention behind how she is saying it. And that creates a mixed reaction. Some people agree with her, some people question her, and some people do both at the same time. At the end of the day, what Wanda said opens the door to a bigger conversation. A conversation about loyalty, about truth, about how people treat each other when cameras are involved. And it also reminds viewers that what they see is not always the full story. There are layers behind every interaction, every argument, and every relationship. And maybe that is the biggest takeaway from all of this. Not just who is right or wrong, but understanding how complicated these dynamics really are. Because when friendships are not real, when trust is limited, and when everyone is trying to protect their own position, things are never going to be simple. So now the question becomes, what happens next? Will people start to take responsibility for their actions? Will relationships change? Or will everything continue in the same cycle, just with different moments and different conflicts? Because one thing is clear, once truths start coming out, even in small pieces, they are hard to ignore. And what Wanda said, whether intentional or not, added another piece to a story that is still unfolding. And what makes it even more powerful is what comes right after that. She says that those same people ended up going against Melody. That is where the emotional weight comes in. Because it is not just about being on a show together. It is about how quickly loyalty can disappear when circumstances change. And that is something a lot of people can relate to, even outside of reality television. But again, Wanda does not stay in that truth for long. She moves right back into defending Tisha. She uses Melody's situation almost like proof that Tisha should not be trusted by anyone, and that people will eventually turn on her too. And while that might sound logical on the surface, it does not fully connect when you look at the full history of events.